So I'm sitting in a recreation of Charles Ives' studio. It was the studio in his summer house in Redding, Connecticut that he shared with his wife Harmony and daughter Edie, really for the last 40 years of his life, from about 1914 to 1954. And many of his principal works had sort of already been composed at that point, but he was someone who always went back and revised work, and he of course continued to work. So the studio was a place that he actively worked and composed music, and I understand it was sort of his sanctuary within this house that he shared with his family. So the Academy has basically took everything that was in the studio, the piano, the books, the papers, the memorabilia, the cot, the desk that was in the studio, and moved it here, and then sort of recreated the bones of the studio to scale. So the walls, the fireplace, the ceiling, the windows, is a recreation of what it would have been like in Ives's house. And then we built a little exhibition around it that explains Ives's relationship to the house and to Connecticut, where he of course was born and grew up. So we had a real sort of attachment to that landscape, and then also a bit about his own musical legacy, and sort of, especially I think the story of sort of how he was really underappreciated really until the very end of his life. And then at the very end, his work was played a few times. He wasn't even able to attend in one instance. And of course, you know, the story from there is that he goes on to become recognized as one of the most significant original American composers ever. You know, it's unusual, I think, for people to see the spaces where artists work, especially in this kind of an intimate scale. You know, the room is kind of dark. It probably would have been brighter in the actual house because we only have one window with natural light. It faces south, so at certain times of year it's very bright, at other times it's less bright. But, you know, it feels, I think, like a sort of cozy den in a way. And then once you take a closer look, you realize that it's filled with all of these really interesting objects. I think there's 3 photographs of Brahms in here. There's 2 metronomes. There's, you know, there's the hat, the coronet, the ballpark sign, all the books. But then there's also strange things, like little things that Ives must have just collected over the years. This project was first, I think, envisioned around 2012. So when Charles Ives' grandson, Charles Ives Tyler, had to sell the Connecticut house where Charles Ives and Harmony Ives had spent their summers, we were approached initially, and I think Yale might also have been approached about the possibility of actually just purchasing the home to sort of make it into a retreat or an artist residency program for composers. And we didn't have the funds to do that at the time. I think we also realized just the sort of tremendous upkeep of doing something like that. And, you know, we're based here in New York. It wasn't practical for us. So there was sort of this impasse because no one wanted the studio to just sort of be completely, you know, demolished, dismantled, and not preserved. So there was sort of a period of time, I remember, where it was sort of like, oh, it's such a shame that this house is selling, but we sort of can't do anything about it, and maybe a lot of the materials can be archived. And Jim Kendrick, who's involved with the Ives Society and is also involved with us as our lawyer for the Ives copyright, the royalties that we have, knew that the Academy had purchased this building that we're in right now, which used to be the headquarters of the American Numismatic Society. The Academy purchased it in 2005 and sort of left it. We couldn't afford to fully renovate it, so we had sort of done some stopgap measures. We replaced the roof. We also renovated some of the galleries. So the galleries that are more to my west were sort of part of this renovation that we did, and we built this glass link between the 2 spaces. But the room that we're in now was still unrenovated, and there's actually a large banker safe behind the studio, behind where the camera is, that also was just sort of left to us because the Numismatic Society collected coins. So there's actually 3 of those large safes in this building. Jim Kendrick knew that we had this other building, much of which was still unrenovated and empty space, and I believe it was him who sort of had this idea of why couldn't we just take the studio, the entire contents, and sort of recreate it here at the Academy as a permanent exhibition. And our president at the time was an architect named Henry Cobb. And I think Harry was really struck with this idea and loved the kind of, I guess, the potential of it. And I guess the background is that the Academy has been the beneficiary of the royalties to Ives's music since 1969 when Harmony Ives passed away. And what initially was a very small sum of money, and the idea was that we would use it to support one scholarship a year to a music student, has grown into this incredible awards program because over time, Ives's music became more popular, it was played more and more, and it became an incredible source of revenue for the Academy. Once we sort of determined that we had a kind of an obligation to sort of help promote Ives's legacy and protect the studio, and theoretically the funds to do it and the space to do it, the sort of, I guess the project just took off from there. So the Academy had an architect named James Vincent Chaika, and he really was in charge of the project rather, and Harry Cobb sort of was like an advisor as the president of the Academy at that time. So Jim Chaika, I mean, the first thing we had to do was kind of identify where in the building this would take place. And what was attractive about this particular location was the window, the natural light window that perfectly lined up with a window that was actually in the studio. So that was attractive. And it actually fit in this space. So it was sort of a multi-fold project. So there was the recreating the studio to scale in this building. So things like the plaster wall, the brickwork, those are all recreations, but they're done to scale. But then we also actually dismantled as much of the original studio as we could. So all of this cabinetry that you see came from the studio and was dismantled and recreated here. And then all of the objects, of course, had to sort of be cataloged where they were, and then recreated here. The windows are also recreations, but they're in the exact location that the original windows were. And then we had this idea of sort of doing this backdrop behind, which of course is a fake window. And then if you were coming into the studio in Ives's actual house, you would have used the double doors that are back there that have all those wonderful papers and photographs on them and posters from concerts. It was sort of Ives's billboard, but we made this cutaway here to my left so that the public could peek in here as well as at the window back there and see the doors, because the doors are so much a part of the exhibition itself. But the studio has a little upright piano that we actually learned was manufactured by a Swedish-American company very close to the Academy, I think around 145th Street. There's sort of what would have been like a gentleman's library of books, sort of an assortment of literature and, you know, fiction, nonfiction reference books, as well as some other really exciting items. His father's coronet. His father played in the Union Army in the Civil War. There's a ball sign, like a ballpark baseball sign that we think he stole from Yale when he was a student. There's his famous hat that you see in many photographs that's sort of crumpled up and the hem has been stitched back together. And then there's a cot, because of course composing is very hard work. And one imagines that he would sort of tinker at the piano for a while and then have to rest and lay down. And there's also a desk. There's two desks actually. And Harmony, we're told, also used this room after Charles passed away. So it sort of became her office in a way. So it's her own things in here as well. It's not just Charles's, and which is nice because they had such a close, connected relationship. The president at the time, Harry Cobb, I think really wanted the project to be completed within the term of his presidency. Academy presidents rotate every 3 years, and it's, you know, difficult to do a project like this even in 3 years. So it was sort of accelerated, and I think the whole thing sort of came together in about a year and a half. I think 2012 we were sort of planning it, 2013 was construction, and then it opened, I believe, in the fall of 2014. So the idea is that the studio is open when our galleries are open for exhibitions, and then it's open by appointment the rest of the year. Often composers or musicians or people who are really interested in Ives's work are excited to see the studio and to come here and to sort of experience it. So we regularly sort of show it in that way. And then it's open when we have our regular exhibitions and our galleries, when we have Academy events too, like our member dinners, our award ceremony. It's also open at that time as well. The American Academy of Arts and Letters is located at the very southern end of Washington Heights, which is a neighborhood in northern Manhattan, quite northern. It starts at 155th Street and goes all the way up to 200th Street or so. And the Academy is sort of on the far west side, so we overlook the Hudson River, we overlook the beautiful Trinity Cemetery across the way. And the studio is sort of part of the 3 buildings that make up the Academy campus, and is in what we call the East Building, which used to be the headquarters of the American Numismatic Society. And it's all part of Audubon Terrace, which is a cultural complex that was founded by Archer M. Huntington sort of at the turn of the 20th century. He was actually a member of the Academy, but before he was a member of the Academy, he was a huge Hispanophile and a scholar of sort of the Iberian Peninsula and its art and literature, and he was a very wealthy man. He had a huge collection of Spanish paintings, Spanish manuscripts, and the idea was to sort of build a center where that could be studied. So that's the Hispanic Society Museum and Library. And then once that building was built, other cultural institutions that he was affiliated with or interested in sort of also got headquartered here as well. So there was the American Geographical Society, the Museum of the American Indian, the Numismatic Society, the Church Our Lady of Esperanza, and then the American Academy of Arts and Letters. When we agreed to take on the studio, the idea was that it would be sort of in perpetuity. It would be an exhibition that would be open to the public always. And I think the idea is that it's not a sort of museum display. It's really supposed to be a room where actual work happened and that it was lived in.